Coming up in July and August will be the first like shoe to drop, if you will. But then moving forward into the September, October, then the whole market thing doesn't work anymore because everybody's going to want physical delivery in the commodities market, and they just won't have the physical to deliver. So what's it going to be? The same thing with corn, same thing with wheat. What happens when they come to the time where everybody's taking physical delivery of the corn crop because it's going to get so lean? See, corn is the thing. We're going to have soybeans and we're going to have wheat, but the corn is going to be the thing that's not going to be there. And if you start tracing out corn, what it's used for, and I'll give you the short cliff notes here. Almost every single product that's in a box on a supermarket shelf uses a corn product. So if the corn around the planet decreases by about 35 or 40%, I'll be conservative and say 30. The amount of corn grown on this planet is going to be 30% below what we need to manufacture and use this year. And I will say it will go as high as 40. If the physical substance isn't there to produce the goods, then what? Like, you can't just print cornstarch. I don't care how rich the central bank is, they can't print ethanol. They cannot print animal feed. That's an impossibility. But if it's physically not there, that's the only thing central banks can't protect against. They can't print food. And then what about the enzymes and the different types of solvents that are needed to break down the corn to turn it into another product? Also a supply chain bottleneck. So even if you get the corn, there might not be the agent that you need to remove the product out of the corn that you need to send on to a factory produce your foods. See, then it starts to spiral in a whole different bunch of directions here, where once you follow corn delivered to a factory or a crushing agent or ethanol producer, see what chemicals they're using or agents or solvents, quote unquote, it's a chemical, to break down the corn to get it to high fructose corn syrup stage, for example. Once you know the chemicals involved in that, solvents, you'll see that the same supply chains running that are getting bottlenecked and delivery delays, almost all that came from China. So that's not coming anymore. So now try to produce corn, that kind of GMO corn that's grown out in the fields there at mass, it needs a huge amount of processes to get it to a usable form. It's not like the old corn that we used to know. So Ransom, what are you hearing on the front for ag right now of disappearance of or non-delivery of?
Backtracking a little bit here. Like you said, it's legal for you to grow cannabis, and then you got alfalfa and all of these other things that you can grow really quickly. So as long as you have a lot of seeds, because you can kind of maintain when things are going that way. But going through the headlines, every angle of any kind of economic or farming or anything, the global chip shortage, which impacts all of the other, arenas out there, another energy price hike expected to hit everybody, of course. And then I'm sure, like you said, you've seen the stock market crashing. They're talking about stocks and bonds are falling lockstep and pace unseen in decades. It's the same amount of people going out of work right now since all the way back in 1947. This is all arranging for a hardcore hit on the Western world. And I don't think they're ready for it. I think people that listen to us, I think they're ready for it, and they're going to be able to handle it. I think you just need to get out there and prepare for the winter. Like throughout the winter, you should be growing those potatoes and onions, garlic, all of that stuff that if you live in the southern states that will handle the winter, and they'll be ready for you in spring. You just got to pack away those beans, rice, and etc. I was wondering, you said that about the corn. That's mainly like what I'm concentrating on this year. And thank goodness that I planted so many of them. So I got probably about 50 outside in the ground that are doing well. And I have hundreds more seeds. And these are the super combined from all of the Native American tribe corn there that's supposed to be drought resistant, cold resistant, water resistant, etc. I was just wondering how many buckets of that do I have to dry and save so that I just have little cubes of money next year, that non-GMO, ready to plant corn, ancient corn that has all of the DNA that was originally there and none of the GMO type DNA. What would that be worth to farmers that just can't get a hold of good seed and They've been buying these Monsanto things. And another point I was going to say is just last year, I didn't even grow but a couple of them, and I produced so many seeds. Seed farming seems to be just as important as food farming. Like if you had a farm that didn't really, of course you're going to eat the excess food, but if your main goal is really to grow a lot of fruits, vegetables, etc., and collect bunches of seed, that's really kind of the easy part. Like one cilantro plant, if you can take care of just one cilantro plant and let it get big and bloom, all the bees love it. And then I got to think thousands of cilantro seeds. You can use that for coriander if you just want to use it for seasoning, or you can just get back to replanting. But all of these things, including squash, melons, all of them summer crops, you can be loading buckets, big jars full of seeds that most people just throw away when they eat the food. Even the stuff from the supermarket, if you go ahead and pay that money to get you a GMO cantaloupe or whatever, I wouldn't want to grow that. But, say you bought an organic one, there's like 300 organic seeds in there. And any residue of glyphosate or whatever that's probably in the organic food as well, just because they use all of the same machinery, shipping, shelf space, etc., it's still contaminated. But whenever you grow those seeds, the plants that you get and the fruit that you get, it's not going to be contaminated anymore. I think it really important this year, besides storing back the food and drying the food and planning for this winter, is to stockpile seeds. If you can produce a plant, even if you're not eating it, you need to save those seeds, dry those seeds. It only takes a couple, minutes at a time for each thing to set it up where you're going to save it. Just imagine some of those old supply stores they show on the westerns and stuff, when the cowboy would come in there and say, give me some tobacco and some alcohol. If you ever notice the way that they did the set was like they really did it. And you look in the background and you see jars of corn, beans, peas, lots and lots of jars of seeds, which is a promise of eating tomorrow. And what's looking like is coming to fruition. And I've noticed that if you look at, let's see here, let's go to this one article here that talks about world hunger here. 25% more due to Ukraine is what they're saying. They were saying that we were already in a food shortage and that it's going to be worse by 25% more just because of the Ukrainian conflict, and that the world hunger was already up. So if that's true, and it's 25% more than already a record high of people coming into the stages of being in a position where they're going to be starving, you can imagine that the United States is going to be spending billions and billions on aid to keep their geopolitical machine working. Meanwhile, they're going to let people here in the U.S. Starve or go hungry or have problems with their mortgages and all of this stuff, because when it comes down to it, you're going to see the average everyday American start losing their cars, their homes, and other things so that they put their children first and make sure that there's food in their tummy, which inevitably increases the amount of homeless people, which inevitably increases the need for excess charity and the government to help, which is a vicious circle because you can see how that exponentially collapses. And you should know that our government's going to do that. They've always done that. We send billions and billions to countries all over the world while we have plenty of homeless people here, plenty of hungry people here. And we even live in a first world country with things like EBT and all of these other things. But people forget you need a residence and you need to be part of their system doing what they want in order to participate in that. So a lot of people opt out of that, and where they end up is on the corner of the street. And you were talking about, you'd bring people in to build your fence. Unfortunately, it seems like there's a lack of those kind of people around these days. I've on a number of occasions tried to pick up homeless people and offered them money, food, cool drinks and everything. And they don't want to do that. They would rather take a handout to the last minute when there is no more handouts coming. And believe me, there's going to become a point when middle class families are struggling so hard that all of these charity outlets that have existed to keep our civilization kind of cohesive, they're going to start evaporating. And I remember a little more than 2 years ago when we first did a show together, and that was one of the points I was talking about at that time, was that the food banks all over the world are struggling and not getting the donations. And this is 2 years ago. So imagine now when things are starting to really run thin, how this course of events is about to play out. more and more needy and hungry people, more and more price hikes on regular, everyday, average Americans who work, and the jobless numbers are going to the toilet. The manufacturing's almost non-existent. Nobody's really producing food. The government's playing games with other governments that seems like to ensure that we have just as much issue as they do. Like Biden said, if they suffer, we suffer, but it's Putin's fault. Remember, it's all Putin's fault, even though all of this was in major swing and almost into the full curve. But circling back to my point, I've been looking at all these charts, and I'm a weird guy with symbols, and I've noticed that if you just took out a history of solar activity all the way back to past the existence of man, you'll see this little heartbeat of the sun going up and down and up and down. And you can clearly see, and we know that at the peak of those, civilization crumbles and falls. And we are exactly at that point. But then I keep going through all these articles talking about world food hunger, price hike, financial bubbles. And if you just overlapped all of those graphs, they would inevitably show you a pattern exactly like the sun. The sun is going into that phase, but we have governments planning for it. And like I've said before, I believe that this is the mass culling, and it's just so polite and so bizarre that people just aren't catching on to what's going on around them.
I'm looking over here on agriculturenews.com/news. High commodity prices shift conservation lands to crop fields. This is a super misleading headline here. And I want you to know it's a misleading headline. I'm going to try to dissect it. They're going to take 1.7 million acres out of long-term conservation reserve. So if you're a farmer, you can put your land on a conservation reserve and the government pays you every year not to farm your land. Plus, you get the whole, like we have here, we have a forest and a reforestation project and, a green belt, and you get all these different initiatives. Like, I'm not going to cut my forest. I want to keep it. I have no intention of cutting it except for like a log or two here that we need for things. That is for me to protect. And that's great that, I get a tax break for having that piece of forest that I want to protect anyway. I'm not going to cut it down. But these people or farmers or whatever corporations that own these farms are now putting it back in and taking off of long-term conservation reserve and putting it back into crop production. Okay, but we're coming back to the same exact thing here. You're not going to print fertilizer. The central banks cannot print fertilizer. They cannot print herbicide. They cannot print diesel fuel. So when farmers don't have the inputs, I don't care if you put 1.7 million acres on, if they don't have the fertilizer and they don't have fuels to run the machines and they don't have the herbicides to take care of whatever pests are out there in this GMO monoculture ridiculous monstrosity that is ag business today, if you don't have those inputs, you're not farming. I don't care. You got 1.7 million acres of grass, basically. There's nothing growing on that. To put 1.7, because I was watching these USDA reports saying they're taking 6 million acres offline because they don't have enough fertilizer and herbicides, and all these farmers are opting to take the prevent plant this year in advance, knowing that there won't be the fertilizers. So this is another scary thing. Our government is giving the farmer the choice to say, hey, we don't have enough herbicides, fertilizer, and machine repair parts for your tractors. So we're going to give you a choice A, and you can just not farm this year, and we're going to give you a huge amount of subsidies beyond what the normal is because we know you're under duress. Or B, you can try to farm it and come in well below at a loss and try to put something into the market, but they say it's going to sky high. Commodities prices are going to continue through the fall. I mean, it's already sky high. It can only go higher from here. And just do the projections out from how much your food has risen in the last year, and then take it out when there's even more scarcity, take it out even doubling or more to the fall. So this misleading headline here, that's the narrative. Okay, we're going to put more crop production out there. We're going to put more, acreage into production. Okay, most people would read that headline and go, cool. Oh, I don't feel bad. There really shouldn't be a food shortage. You know what? They're putting 1.7 million acres back in there. No way. That's going to grow a lot of extra food. But if you don't have the seed, the fertilizer, herbicide, diesel, machine repair parts, or an active market to trade that, you don't have any food. So it's so misleading. So misleading. I'm looking at the Ag Economy Barometer report. This is out of Purdue University, and they say 75% of the people that are involved in agriculture have a negative outlook on what the price increases are going to affect their business coming up through the end of the year. 3 out of 4 are saying, whoa, we got some serious problems with prices here. We don't know if we can afford this stuff to even grow your food for y'all this year. That's where it's heading right now. Like, what? And then I'm looking at this 3 big things today: wheat futures, corn futures, soy futures soaring, overnight trading. I mean, we're coming into that perfect storm. And again, if you were a government, would you tell the people that we were at the beginning of the cycle right now? Because the onset into the cycle is the most tumultuous in terms of planting and harvesting dates and economy and value and asset class and asset determination on what value is to settle between nations or government and company, or company to company, or individual to company, or company to individual. It just doesn't matter. At that point, it all is upset. Nothing can be quantified anymore, because these notional values that we've had that have been stable for 100 years have just been thrown out the window in every way, shape, or form.
Right. I definitely think that everybody that's been paying attention the last couple of years really doesn't have much to worry about. But if you know people that are willing to listen, you need to spread the word and kind of warn them. Things are about to get really thin, something that most people have not seen in their lifetime. So get ready.
Being more responsible for gardening and getting some of your own food production up and running immediately to be able to just get through this period from now to harvest season. Know that you can have the skills to do it, share with others, and then as we go from harvest season into the planting season of next year, when it gets really rough, tough, hyperinflated prices, social unrest, you'll already be prepared for it. Because I really have to ask you the statistical possibility of the entire world entering a phase right now where we're going to grow less food from this year forward through 2028 to 2930, which would upset the balance of society itself. That at this very moment, there's so much chaos on the planet happening seemingly organically that rose out of the COVID. Really? And you got people talking about the reset at the same exact time of the onset of the cycle, this grand solar minimum. You can't tell me that this many things are overlapping in history that only occur either once every 400 years or once every 2,000 years, that all these things are overlapping right this second. These days, that's further than a stretch. Silly putty is going, whoa, hold on. That's stretching a little too much there. Stretching a little too much. Put me back in the egg, man. Let me go. The reason I was stringing that story there is I went today and we were getting some fencing, and it's going to be a live fence. The whole thing's a living fence project. But as I was waiting, because they don't have enough people there working to load 1,000 feet of fence onto something and then shrink wrap it and put it on a pallet and get it on the truck, it took too long. So we're sitting there for like an hour trying to get people to load something. We bought some guinea fowl. And why would I say guinea fowl, not chicken? Well, if you know a porpoise and you know a fish, they're very different, but they're similar. Well, guinea fowl and chicken are the same way. Snake and eel. Similar but different. Guinea fowl and chicken, similar but different. So the reason we chose the guinea fowl, for those of you wanting to raise those out there, the eggs have more protein than chicken egg. They're smaller, so they take up less space with a denser volume of protein. And they're voracious insect eaters, where they're going to run along the fence line or in your garden and chew all the insects but not ruin your plants like chicken do. You leave a chicken out, they're going to like scratch through your garden and tear up all your plants. But guinea fowl, they're just interested in the insects. They're like, cool, man. Thanks for the yummy, chewy stuff, and we're on to the next thing. In addition, they're guard dogs themselves. They start to know their environment. And so here's the thing I wanted to allude to, that was security. So you might think that is so outlandish. If you say guard dogs, okay, you understand what I mean. Guard dogs, like you got animal 1, 2, whatever, living on property. And as soon as they hear something out of the normal, they start barking and run toward it, or whatever they do, their response. And something, wait, dog's barking, something's different. Well, guinea fowl are the exact same, but in a bird species. So not only do you have dogs, but you would also have guinea fowl, both alerting, because the dogs and the guinea fowl go into different locations across the property. So think about that. You got different kinds of warning devices across different working areas of the property. But at the same time, the guinea fowl are eating all the ticks, any kind of worms and butterflies and caterpillars and slugs and all those things that you're talking about, pill bugs, those things would eat them up. So how many lines deep can you go into using nature to help you benefit as we move through this transition period right now? Every single aspect of using what we know as knowledge of our forefathers and what we know now, what we can trade on the line, internet here, it's all going to be needed so deeply. I mean, how can you get a higher yield? I mean, that's the whole thing. That's going to be water cooler talk in the next, before October comes up, water cooler talk's going to be like, what are you composting? How do I get, how do I get more nitrogen in my compost? That's going to be water cooler talk. Anhydrous will be a well-known word. Phosphate, potash, those would be like common words. They're not now. Hey, remember, what was that? Social distancing. Nobody knew what that meant. And then everybody knows what it means. Well, phosphate or NPK ratios will be something that's very same by the end of October going into next year.
No, I was just thinking when you were talking about that social distancing, how far are you going to have to social distance after a collapse of the world food supply? And I kind of wanted to get back to
Stay off my property.
Yeah, I'm looking at this graph, and this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. And this shows this article's from Yahoo Finance. It says world hunger exploding after 25% spike before the Ukraine war. And it has a little graph here. It says global food index has soared since the war began in Ukraine. But this map immediately reminds me, or this graph, excuse me, of this picture right here, which is the glacial, interglacial cycles over the past 450,000 years. And I know you know a lot about this. And, just looking at this picture that everybody's looking at here, looks like a heartbeat or whatever. So this is the sun's activity, cold, we get glacial periods, but also on this is a map of disappearance of species. Like you can lay over a map. I mean, excuse me, I keep saying map. I mean graph. That's kind of how my mind works. Graphs are maps to me. I mean, it maps out time, whatever. But you could clearly see where all of the die-offs happen on the same glacial, interglacial map. And it comes down to today, where we're right after this big spike, not unlike the other interglacials. And what happens after that is what we're talking about. We're going right into this phase off the graph here at the end to where we're going into a glacial. And so am I to believe, like you see articles from California right now, they're going to conserve even more water due to climate change and drought and et cetera, which means less farming, less ranching. Now, when you have all of these artificial factors put into place and then you overlap them on this graph here, you can see that back then, I doubt there were too many governments, interfering with people in the way that they are now. So how does that kind of incorporate into this graph where we're about to have a big drop off into a glacial period, a cooling, whatever you want to call it? And am I to believe that this graph is just going to go up further and the super big spike into infinity, and this interglacial is never going to stop? Or am I to believe the cycle that I could clearly see for the past 450,000 years is going to repeat itself again? And I'm looking at this graph, and this graph clearly shows spikes and troughs. Me as a layman person, when I'm looking at this graph, I don't know. I remember, junior high, they told me that cycles indicates what will be next. I remember doing these in school. Okay, well, if there's a spike here and a trough here and a spike here and a trough here, estimate the next little bit of the graph. So could you do that for us and tell us what this graph means and what do we expect next on the portion of the graph that's not there yet, that's in the future?
I don't know. I just learned what I learned and know what I know. Growing kumquats. Why don't scientists disagree? Before, when I was growing up, that was the whole thing, is scientists would always argue. There was never really consensus amongst them except louder voices trying to say my theory is right or incorrect, or yours is incorrect, mine's right. But it was never a solidification of all the full narrative moving and marching in one direction. There was always way more than a fringe. Like the average would be trying to discount what was proven to have the next latest discovery, so their name would be etched in the history books for discovering something. That's the way it used to work. That was the dream of scientists, to have your name etched in the annals of history, that you, or annals, excuse me. But that's what they wanted. That was the whole thing. It was about getting the job, getting the title. that was the competition of the wanting of that job. And that's why people would gravitate toward that academia arena. But now everything is in agreement. It just doesn't make sense. Like, why don't scientists argue anymore? And Ransom, if I could add something to the 450,000 year chart that you're looking at, you can go back about, they have good data to about 3 million years prior. It's actually about 2.8 million years of successive ice ages being way less severe back then. And it seems to get more severe each progressive. And that last 500,000 years where we're talking about as the deepest of the ice ages this planet has ever seen, going back 3 million years when they started. It was like a very light version 2.5 million years ago of an ice age, what we consider like 2 miles of ice covering Chicago and whatnot, and scraping out the Great Plains, and all those Great Lakes got sculpted by the same glaciers receding of, talking 2 mile deep ice moving forward, scraping things, creating great soils, by the way. But going back 3 million years, it was, not as nearly as severe as that. And then it got a little more severe. And then we're talking about obliquity. And did something change with the planetary orbit over these millions of years where it seems to be swinging, or the Birkeland current firing our stars seems to be waning, or something along this type of line of millions of years? When we sit at this juncture right now, where that line goes is into what they call a super ice age, or snowball Earth after this one. Because if you go back to the 400,000 year, what you're looking at is not temperature spike, but the duration between the onset of the next deepest. And you'll find those same where we sit right now, where it looks like instead of going to that giant peak that it did, where the temperature might be 1 degree Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius at the higher than the lowest minimums of the ice age, or lowest maximums, however you want to look at it in a warmer sense. You have to go back and find that about every 500,000 years in the geologic record as well, what they can find with temperature. What we're looking at, that same is sort of even, and then it drops off, versus being a giant spike and then straight down. That's on a cycle too. And what's interesting is that cycle is coalescing and coinciding with all of the cycles we're seeing now, but also the cycles of how governments are trying to respond to people's behaviors, electromagnetic frequency changes, interplanetary magnetic field changes, with all atmospheres on all planets changing. And then trying to keep some semblance of an economy, to keep some trade going for continuity government during this time. If you're the government and this natural cycle is here, would you tell the citizens of what is happening? Would that cause more panic, or would it cause less panic by, slowly conditioning lockdowns into slowly conditioning? We're going into rationing in October. They got you started on the COVID. Stand in line in front of the supermarket. Limit of 1, limit of 2. What if you knew this? We were descending into another deeper cooling, maybe before we ultimately step off into an ice age. And I mean, that's just natural fact. We're eventually, in some time in the future, we're going into an ice age. Not saying tomorrow, don't put me on the record. I'm just saying in the future, based on everything ever known in science, we're going to go into an ice age in the next 1,000 years or so, 100%. But why don't scientists disagree on the time that we're entering this and what the cooling will be pre-entry into an ice age? Because where we sit, this is the longest Holocene or interglacial period that we have had in the last 500,000 years. You don't think something special is happening? Like, how fast is that going to drop off? Versus a spike and then a runoff? It's going to drop straight off. But there's got to be at least 1 or 2 bumps. It's never going to be a vertical cliff down, except for the Younger Dryas dropping something like 16 degrees Celsius around 12,500 years ago. But we sit with that little kind of heartbeat spike and then dropping off. So if we come off right now into this deep cooling, it's going to bound back up again. But during this deep cooling and electromagnetic effects, and the sun's changing electromagnetic fields, second magnetic field is forming in the outer solar system with the gas giants lining up in 2024, October, the heaviest interplay of those two toroid magnetic fields here on our Earth overlapping in the Bosch wall. Something like that, deep. Now you're the elite and you know this is happening. Now what?